1914, Britain stood at a crossroads it hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, most British citizens saw it as a distant Balkan affair, the kind of political turbulence that occasionally rippled through Europe but rarely reached their shores. The newspapers reported it with interest but not alarm. Life continued in its ordinary rhythms. Men went to work, children played in the streets, and the empire that stretched across a quarter of the globe seemed as permanent as the stones of Westminster. But empires are built on promises, and Britain had made promises. When Germany invaded Belgium on August 4, violating the Treaty of London that guaranteed Belgian neutrality, Britain faced a decision that would reshape the world. The cabinet met in tense sessions, arguments echoing through the corridors of power. Some believed intervention was a matter of honor and treaty obligation. Others saw it as a catastrophic mistake that would drain British blood and treasure for someone else's war. At 11 p.m. that night, Britain's ultimatum to Germany expired unanswered, and the nation found itself at war. The response was extraordinary. Young men flooded recruitment offices, forming lines that stretched around city blocks. They came from factories and farms, from universities and coal mines, believing they were answering a call to defend civilization itself. Lord Kitchener's face appeared on posters across the country, his finger pointing directly at the viewer, declaring, "Your country needs you." Within weeks, hundreds of thousands had enlisted. They trained with wooden rifles because there weren't enough real ones. They drilled in civilian clothes because uniforms hadn't been manufactured yet. They sang songs and wrote letters home filled with confidence that they'd be back by Christmas. The British Expeditionary Force crossed the Channel in August, a professional army of roughly 100,000 men, the best trained soldiers Britain had ever fielded. They marched into Belgium to face the German advance, and at Mons on August 23, they fired their rifles so rapidly and accurately that German forces believed they were facing machine guns. The British held their position, then retreated in good order, fighting delaying actions that gave French forces time to regroup. The newspapers celebrated British pluck and courage. What they didn't report was the exhaustion, the confusion, the realization among the soldiers that this war was nothing like they'd imagined. By September, the war had found its character. At the First Battle of the Marne, the Allied forces stopped the German advance toward Paris, and the war of movement froze into something else entirely. Soldiers on both sides began digging trenches, temporary positions they thought would last a few weeks. The trenches deepened and extended, spreading across Belgium and France like scar tissue, and suddenly the war had a front line that barely moved. British soldiers found themselves in muddy ditches, staring across no man's land at German soldiers in their own muddy ditches, both sides waiting for something to change. The First Battle of Ypres came in October and November, a desperate struggle for a medieval Belgian town that most British soldiers had never heard of before. The British Expeditionary Force held the line against overwhelming German attacks, but the cost was staggering. Of the original professional army that had crossed the Channel, nearly half were casualties by the end of the year. Entire regiments were decimated. The old contemptibles, as they'd ironically called themselves after a German reference to Britain's contemptible little army, had proven themselves anything but contemptible, but they'd been shattered in the process. Back home, Britain was transforming. Factories that had made textiles began making uniforms. Engineering works that had built locomotives started producing artillery shells. Women took jobs that men had left behind, working in munitions plants and driving buses and doing 1,000 tasks that society had previously insisted only men could do. The Defense of the Realm Act gave the government sweeping powers to control information, resources, and daily life. German shops were vandalized. Dachshunds were kicked in the street because they seemed too German. The country that had entered the war with confidence was learning what total war actually meant. As 1914 ended, Britain faced a reality none of its leaders had predicted. This wasn't going to be a quick war. It wasn't going to be over by Christmas. The trenches stretched from the Channel to Switzerland, and breaking through them seemed impossible. The professional army that Britain had sent to France was gone, replaced by volunteers who were still learning to be soldiers. The casualty lists grew longer each week, and in towns and villages across Britain, families received telegrams that began with the words they'd learned to dread. The men in the trenches celebrated Christmas with an unofficial truce in some sectors, emerging from their holes to exchange cigarettes and play football with the enemy. Officers on both sides were horrified, but the soldiers had briefly remembered that the men across no man's land were human too. It wouldn't happen again. By the next Christmas, too much blood had soaked into the mud, too many friends had died, and the innocence of August 1914 seemed like something from another lifetime. Britain's first year of the Great War had ended, but the war itself had only just begun.